Hi,
Okay.
everyone, and welcome. My name is Glenn Diesen, and I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Professor Sergey Karaganov, who is an honorary chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy in the Russian Federation, and he has also been a former advisor of both President Yeltsin and President Putin. President Putin. Welcome to the both of you.
Well, I've never. Yes, I'm happy to see you. Though I've been advising even writing speeches for Brezhnev, or parts of speeches. Of course, very small. But I've never been in any formal position ever with any of the leaders. I am completely quasi-independent. Of course, I was a member of the Presidential Council, but it was not exactly position of an advisor. It was the highest council in body during Yeltsin, but I resigned in protest in '88 when I saw that Yeltsin regime is getting absolutely rotten. But anyway, I'm helping my leaders of my country because I'm a responsible citizen.
So, the topic we really wanted to discuss with you today is, of course, Russia changing its nuclear doctrine by lowering the nuclear threshold. So, in other words, expanding the possible scenarios in which it's illegal under Russian law to use nuclear weapons. And I guess you're the ideal person to explain why Russia's taken this dramatic step, given that you are also the person who has perhaps been pushing the hardest for a change in the nuclear doctrine. I read, I think, most of the articles and interviews you have done on this topic. And I remember 1 year ago when we were at this Evaldai meeting in Sochi, Putin addressed you personally and argued at that point that Russia was not ready to change its nuclear doctrine. However, 1 year later now, obviously a lot has changed, and Putin has obviously also changed his mind, and he's now taking your advice, it would seem. So I'm looking forward to hearing a discussion between the two of you next month as well. So, Professor Karaganov, I was wondering therefore if you can explain this decision by Russia and by Putin to.
Let's put it this way. I'm not in a position to explain the position of our president, though, of course, that we communicated with him in open audiences later, and probably understand what he's thinking. But I could give only my own understanding of the subject. So. Russia, let's go back. Russian nuclear doctrine was, and also Russian military policy was based mostly on the ideas inherited from the 70s and 80s. It was absolutely outdated. Even I could not fully understand how come that our nuclear doctrine was so counterproductive at best. Probably people want to just didn't think about that. I mean, and also they were some of them were willing to look nice to the outside world, and but it was completely counterproductive from the point of view both of Russian interests and interests of international stability. First of all, I mean, the low in nuclear threshold and actually doing away with nuclear factor in our foreign policy paved the way to NATO expansion. People that didn't understand that at that time. I was trying to persuade my competitors, including in the leadership. I mean, that was that we were on a dangerous path. I mean, openly I was saying that we will get a war since been publishing that since 87, no, 97, I'm sorry. But I mean, at that time there was still a belief that, I mean, we're dealing with decent people, and that the basic myths of the old nuclear age prevailed. So the situation became absolutely untenable when several years ago when it was clear that we are heading for an open confrontation, and Russia made several mistakes. First it was late with issuing an ultimatum. Second, when issuing an ultimatum, it was Russia probably was not ready to use all instruments it had. So we got what we got, and that is a protracted war with already more million, several, maybe 2 million sacrifices on the part of Ukraine, and a few tens of Russian soldiers dying. I don't know the exact figure, but the Ukrainians are suffering, of course, a lot, and they were sacrificed by our Western now enemies, absolutely cynical, and just thrown into the fire. Now other Europeans are being prepared for the fate. Hopefully, we will avoid that. Also, the low nuclear threshold, and also somehow disregarding the nuclear factor in international affairs was growingly counterproductive because of the general trend, not only Russia Western trends. The world, the tectonic plates under the international system have shifted away, and so entering a long period of adjustment, which is automatically will bring a lot of tensions and wars. And by evading the nuclear factor, we kind of paved the way to a new wave of wars, not only between Russia and the West. And that was also irresponsible. And I openly, both in writing and in more in publishing in published articles and in more discreet ways, has been explaining that. So that is a task, I think, for Russia to return nuclear factor into the center, and to overcome their strategic priorities, which has engulfed many in the world, especially in the Western elite, who just lost understanding what history is, what war is, and who are not afraid of war, not only nuclear war, but any war. And they think that that is something different. And we have an absolutely responsible and growingly irresponsible group of people in Europe, in elites. Americans are a bit better. They're more, but still, I mean, they're also going that way. Just to give you a very simple example, there are many. At one point, because when I released the discussion a year and a half ago or something, open discussion, and I was, of course, I started to look more attentively at what are the reactions from the West, and I saw somewhere in August or and maybe September last year, two pronouncements by President Biden and his Secretary of State. He's the fourth person or the third to supplant the president, or if he or she dies. So they both said more or less that climate change is in a few years is worse than a nuclear war. That was, I mean, I did not believe, but that happens. And that brought me to understanding that we heading towards a disaster, because the only reason not to go to multiple wars and eventually to plunge into a third world war, which basically is already starting, is to restore nuclear deterrence and fear of hell. So that's why So that's why I started openly to this discussion, and I'm happy to see that eventually my efforts and efforts of other colleagues are bearing fruits.
I think what is being discussed here, it seems to me, is the re-establishment of deterrence. This idea that there are things that you cannot do if you're one of the players on the international system, because if you do that, if you go beyond a certain point and transgressed to particularly the interests of another power, another great power, then of course you risk a war, a war which, if it becomes a nuclear war, you might not survive. Now, there was many examples of deterrence during the Cold War, and I just wanted just to list a few. There's one which everybody who is familiar with British history is very familiar with, which was in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. The Soviet Union, Marshal Bulganin, who was the Soviet Prime Minister at that time, communicated to the United States that what was in effect a Soviet ultimatum, the Anglo-French operation in Suez needed to be called off. If it wasn't, there was a risk of the Soviet Union intervening with nuclear weapons. Then there was the 1961 Berlin crisis, an even more dangerous event, when the work began on what is called the Berlin Wall. There was a face-off between American and Soviet troops in Berlin. There was absolutely explicit warnings, again from the Soviet side, because there was lots of talk, during the Berlin crisis, of the West intervening to prevent that happening and sending troops there. It didn't happen because, again, deterrence, nuclear deterrence, was effective. Then there was another episode, which I actually remember. I remember reading about it when it happened, which is in the early 1970s, when during the Vietnam War, there was concerns about the fact that the Soviet Union was sending ships with weapons supplies to Haiphong in North Vietnam. There was some talk of attacking and bombing those Soviet ships. It was widely talked about at the time. It was understood that doing that would be an act of war against the Soviet Union. Again, deterrence, nuclear deterrence played a role, and that idea was buried. And then, of course, in 1973, during the Middle East War, the October War that took place at that time, there was a moment again when Israel seemed to be advancing deep inside Egypt, west of the canal, deep into Egypt as well. And again, the Soviet Union at that time made absolutely clear to the United States, in what was in effect an ultimatum, that that really had to stop. And the result was a ceasefire and agreements to try to negotiate a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict through the peace conference in Geneva, which never happened, which is another story. But those were deterrence events. And we can see that their overall effect was to actually reduce tensions. It meant that instead of the situation getting completely out of control in the Middle East in the 1956 and 73, in Europe with the Berlin crisis, in Vietnam with the proposals to attack the Russian ships, the Soviet ships going to Haiphong. What actually happened as a result of all of those events is that we actually got détente instead, and we also got. I haven't mentioned obviously what I think in Russia you call the Caribbean crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was perhaps another extreme example of deterrence, the closest we got during the Cold War to deterrence breaking down. But the point was that we actually got a period of détente develop out of all of these events, because the two sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, understood that each side had that potential capability, and that they each had red lines which they would defend. And the important thing was to establish communication and dialogue and to work out where the red lines on each side were. And that actually, for a significant period, secured peace in Europe. So I think this is what we're talking about. We're actually, by talking about re-establishing deterrence, we might find our way back to some kind of understanding and eventual peace. Now, am I being wrong in what
And
I've said?
you're absolutely right. I would add to that several other episodes. I mean, including the Korean War, when this issue was on the table, but they decided it's too dangerous. At Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French desperately tried to persuade Americans to use nuclear weapons against the Vietnamese. Americans again didn't yield on that matter. So there were many other small issues, and the whole issue of deterrence is it has many functions. I count 9. So very soon, and I've published an article in International Affairs in the magazine of Minister of Foreign Affairs on that issue. I mean, a year ago, then I published several other articles on functions of deterrence. Very soon, I shall send you a book, a small book on a new theory of deterrence, where all these matters are discussed, and also we propose and also new theories and also new ways to strengthen deterrence. But it's not only. And what is very important was that nuclear deterrence, until very recently, had one of the most important functions was avoidance of war between great powers. And say even 5-7 years ago, if you asked Henry Kissinger or myself, or I don't know, even Zbigniew Brzezinski, is a war in Central Europe possible against a nuclear power? All of us would have said, "Are you crazy?" But that happens, and that is partially, I would say, we have to take part of the blame. Because we disregarded this issue, we Russians disregarded these issues, and eventually did not act as a responsible actor, thinking that some things will, somehow will dissolve. But they were building up everywhere. Also, I could again stress that avoidance of big wars, especially between nuclear powers, is a much more pertinent issue in the coming, say, 2 decades, because of these major shifts in an international system with new powers, rising all powers. Sliding away, going down, and there will be a lot of tensions. We already see, opening up of Pandora boxes in the Middle East. There will be new tensions in South Asia. Of course, we all know about China, South China, and South China Sea. There will be tensions around the new rising powers in Indonesia, and so on. It's inevitable. So that is why it is absolutely important and to restore the fear of nuclear weapons, and that was the major reason why I started to introduce this issue into the international discussion, which I opened up. It was not a Pandora box. I hope eventually it will help the humanity. to survive if we do the right decisions. There was, of course, the Russian problem, and that is how to finish, how to win the war with the West on the territory of Ukraine without sacrificing too many of our best men. But it is important, but it is, I would say, secondary. The main thing is to avoid the inevitable slide towards Third World War because of the neglect of all these tensions and neglect of the role of nuclear weapons. It was nuclear weapons. I'm a historian of nuclear strategy, and I could add to your list.
Absolutely.
Many in 1981, I could say that we Soviets sent a powerful signal to the Reagan administration that they're preparing. The Soviets were believing that the Americans were preparing for a nuclear attack. I mean, after that, most of the people, in 1 or 2 years, most of the hawks in the Reagan administration were dismissed and supplanted by more responsible and reasonable people. And Reagan started to calm down. And eventually it brought up Reagan-Gorbachev meetings, which had, of course, dubious meaning, but nevertheless, people, things were under control. But now we have to do something, because I do not believe in the ability of humanity, and especially in the ability of the Western elites, which are collapsing, and to act responsibly, because what is happening is unbelievable. I mean, the war, a big war on the border and of a nuclear power, and talk about winning that war is something. I mean, it's idiotic, crazy. I don't know how to use how many words. It's absolutely impossible. The question is, how people just think about what are they what they're doing. And that's why I have been persuading my own people and others that we have to lower the nuclear threshold, to put the nuclear issue back on the table, and to persuade our Western enemies, or if they still have any brains, to back away, to acknowledge defeat, and before it is too late for them. There are two basic reasons: avoidance of big war, and finishing this war in Europe, which has been unleashed by the West.
I very much agree, though, that the nuclear peace definitely seemed to have collapsed, more or less, as Alexander pointed out. There used to be a time when we would call on the limitation of nuclear powers, given that nuclear weapons made it necessary to de-escalate. But we don't hear this anymore, any talk about de-escalation. Instead, what we hear is, we shouldn't reward nuclear blackmail. We shouldn't reward nuclear saber rattling. We shouldn't reward, this overall. Well, what else do we call it? Anyway, so all of this, it's seen as we're effectively selling it now as being immoral to accept this nuclear peace. So if you accept deterrent, that means it becomes an immorality. So it's a very strange thing and absurd, I guess, to reject the entire nuclear peace, which we depended on. But I wanted to ask you more specifically about the last interview you did, because it made me think about how we're climbing up the escalation ladder. In this interview, you argued that if the NATO countries support using drones against the Kremlin again, then Russia should do a strike on Reichstag, or alternatively, if there's strike deep inside Russia, to strike facilities in NATO countries, the logistics which fuels the war going into Ukraine, the weapons going into Ukraine. Now, my first thought was that this seemed hawkish, but I do also accept, on the other hand, that as you argue, that Russia's timid response following the last time the Kremlin was attacked, it's obviously damaged the deterrent, and this seems somewhat undeniable. I see our media as well, where Russia's restraint or limited response was interpreted as weakness, and we can see Joe Biden himself. He at one point said we can't send F-16s since World War III. Now the rhetoric is Russia doesn't dare to respond, so let's continue to escalate. But what I was wondering, what you said seems to suggest is Russia should be prepared to go up the escalation ladder. That means either do direct attacks on NATO countries, but then if NATO responds again and we end up in a large conventional mutual strikes, you also argued that there should be a nuclear strike, a limited nuclear war, but you advocated striking the Europeans before the United States. I was wondering if you could say something about this nuclear ladder or escalation ladder, as you see it.
Well, first of all, I mean, even this debate, which we have unleashed, is already having somewhat calming influence on the hot heads, at least in Washington. European elites simply have lost their minds. I mean, a year and a half ago, they were talking that Russia would never use nuclear weapons. Then, after the start of this debate, they started to talk about avoidance of nuclear escalation. Of course, I mean, a lot of pundits, especially in Europe, who do not understand anything about that, are still saying that Russia would never use that bluff, etc. But Americans are getting much more cautious. I hope there are still there are some people, at least in the military and etc. elsewhere, who understand, I mean, the realities of this world. However, one of the reasons why I started to introduce this issue and putting it on the table is that we see a very rapid deterioration of the Western ruling elites. And so if we do not do something now, in several years, we'll have a situation which is much worse. So we have to climb the ladder of escalation as soon as, and we have started already. We are preparing for. We deployed long-range missiles in Belarus. We conducted several types of nuclear exercises, and we announced preparation for restoration of tests of nuclear weapons, and there will be several other steps. I will send you our book very soon. So there are some description of these letters, but I do not want to speculate on that because it is the matter of highest authority. Which of the recommendations or of others to use. But of course, we still have several steps, at least I think 10 or maybe 12, to climb up the ladder of nuclear escalation if it doesn't work. But I hope it will work because Americans, and at least Americans, understand what will be the reality. Even if a limited nuclear strike happens, not only I'm not speaking about, I mean, the possible escalation to a total nuclear war, which would end, I mean, modern civilization as it is. But even a limited nuclear strike, say on the territory of the United States, would bring a collapse of the United States, the country with 650 million weapons and hence of the population. Imagine what will start there. It's one of the elements. Europeans simply do not understand that, unfortunately, and hope that there are some people still in Europe, or Americans will persuade them when they understand the inevitability of going up the ladder. But I hope still that we will not have to go to the actual use of nuclear weapons because it is it's a terrible moral sin. Even if Europeans deserve to be done away with because they have unleashed 2 world wars in the previous century and now are trying to unleash a 3rd world war. I just imagine it's unbelievable. Even if they deserve, their children and many decent people there. So we would very much prefer not to use weapons, and also because if we use nuclear weapons even very successfully, and we could use nuclear weapons very successfully, I mean, NATO would collapse. Governments will fall apart, etc., etc., etc. I mean, it will open up a Pandora box. These weapons will become usable.
Sorry.
And before, I mean, 10, 15, 20 years ago, in discussions of these issues with senior thinkers in the West, we were saying that telling each other that, I mean, the worst scenario is that India and Pakistan exchange nuclear blows, and the world would not collapse. But then this psychological threshold will be overcome. So I do not want to overcome this the threshold first for moral reasons, and second because it could open up. I mean, the Pandora box, and third, of course, there is a possibility of escalation up to the level of total nuclear exchange. Though I believe that the chances are very limited. Americans would never use nuclear weapons against Russia, as Americans never even thought of using nuclear weapons in defense of Europe against Soviet Union in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, the whole nuclear strategy of NATO is a complete bluff. When even theoretically they were discussing these issues, was the use of nuclear weapons against Soviet tank columns. I mean, going towards La Manche on the territory of Germany. And I spoke to a German chancellor, and it is now well known fact that the chancellors, when they were faced with this possibility, just ran out of the communications center, so they would not be blamed even to think about using nuclear weapons on the territory of Germany. So, and there was never anybody seriously discussed in the late 50s possibility of nuclear strikes against Soviet Union, territory of the Soviet Union. Maybe against. But people remembered war. Now they forgot war, and there is a general deterioration of Western elites, and that is very dangerous. And of course, we also have the growth of elites in new powerful countries with inevitable tensions between them. So we have to reintroduce this nuclear fuse into the system. Unfortunately, or other barriers on the way towards, I mean, age of wars, as I call it, or not working for the time being.
What I wanted to say is that I think anybody who's listening very carefully to what you're saying understands that the purpose of what you're discussing is to secure peace. That the reality, I say that because the way it's been presented in the West is that this whole discussion in Russia is somehow menacing and threatening. It is not menacing and threatening. It is intended to try and find a stable framework to re-establish peace. And as somebody who lived through the 70s, I can say for a fact that I never felt more secure than I felt secure at that time. During the period of détente, the idea of a nuclear war between the superpowers was actually unthinkable. It was everybody I remember at that time spoke about a very stable situation which existed in Europe. And this is where I want to come to the Europeans, because I think you're making this distinction between the Americans and the Europeans. The thing that has happened is that, and by the way, Glenn has written, I think, in a superb book about this, is that with the Cold War ending, it wasn't just the fact that Russia's nuclear doctrine remained frozen in the world of the 70s and 80s. It was also a perception that grew that Russia was no longer an important factor in international relations. So the Europeans in particular said to themselves, right, now we can do whatever we want. We can reorganize Europe. We now don't have to think about the Russians anymore. We have all kinds of issues with the Russians, which some European countries do. Not all of them. I'm from a country, Greece, which doesn't have issues with Russia, but Britain undoubtedly does. I don't understand why, but they do. So they thought they could do all kinds of things in Europe, and now, horror of horrors, the Russians are back. It turns out that they're far more powerful, far better organized, and much stronger than we thought they were. And I think that this is the cause of all the crisis and tension and anger that we see in Europe now, because the Europeans have suddenly discovered that they've lost that, or that they're losing that time and space that they thought they had, when they could do all sorts of things to rearrange the structures in Europe, the geography of Europe, the economic relationships in Europe, and ignore what the Russians thought, and in fact, to some extent, adapt the Russians to their purposes. Now, that brings me to the other point, because, of course, Russia, as I said, is reestablishing itself, definitely, as a great power. That is the big story of the last 3 years, in my opinion. The second is this change in doctrine, the doctrinal change, which is, I think, connected to this. Can you explain what, in Russian terms, why you need to have a nuclear doctrine at all? Because the sort of popular view in a place like London, if you ask people, is that, well, it's all decided by Putin. He makes the decision all by himself. Russia does, when you tell them that the Russians have a doctrine and that they have ideas about when nuclear weapons can be used, it comes as a surprise. Is this nuclear doctrine, is this doctrine actually a law? Is it something that is intended to communicate to the Western powers when Russia will use nuclear weapons? Or does it have some normative effect within Russia itself? Does it shape decision-making in a crisis so that when the president has to make a decision, he does so within a particular framework which the doctrine sets out? That's a question. I appreciate I might be coming very close to asking a question about things that might be sensitive and which Russians might not want to talk about too much, because decision-making processes of that nature might, for I know, even be classified. But nonetheless, I ask the question.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with your argument, but I will add, as to my understanding of the positions of Europeans, it is the hate and is much deeper. They start to understand, and Americans too, but to a less extent, that what Soviet Union and then Russia has done is that they undermined their sweet 500 years of their dominance in the world system, which gave Europe and then the West the possibility to suck juices from the whole humanity. And I would say it was a military rent. Europe and the West has been predominant for 500 years, colonizing, raping the world, and then establishing neo-colonial ways of siphoning off resources from the rest of the world. Now, our European neighbors have to understand that they have to work for a living at last, and that is unpleasant. And I understand them, by the way, but I have no sympathy with them. Yes, Russia is to be blamed. It undermined the positions of bandits and robbers. I mean, bandits and robbers, even if they believe that they are decent people, do not like when they are cut off from the sources of their wealth, which were, I mean, mostly, of course, sucking the juices from their outside world. As to rule nuclear doctrine, it is not only to persuade our enemies, or potential enemies, by the way, and to civilize international relations now and in the future, but it has, of course, to do a lot with preparations, with deployment, with decisions which weapons to build and to deploy, to the whole thinking mechanism of the military. If they're saying that they would not use nuclear weapons only under unbelievable circumstances, they are morally and technically not prepared to use them. But now, probably, they are already preparing for actual use, and and also I'm sure the decision has been made to deploy new types of nuclear carriers or nuclear missiles and some others, and that our military will be prepared and will be prepared for actual use in case of need. But I hope that this case will never come. So nuclear doctrine is very important. Also, there is, of course, it's a tip of the iceberg. The problem, I mean, there is a lot. The problem is that the tip was, I mean, suppressing the iceberg. Now, I mean, the tip will develop the iceberg, and that is why it is important for us, and also it is important for the highest leadership of the country. If they were professing and actually believing in the idea that Russia should use nuclear weapons under most unthinkable circumstances, they were morally unprepared. Now they're getting more prepared in case, and that helps deterrence. I hope again that even this moral preparedness, which you see happening just in front of our eyes, will never bring us to the actual use. Because, as I've said, I think it is highly immoral and also relatively dangerous in terms of long-term world peace, even if we could win this war easily. But we have to change also our minds, and that is happening very rapidly.
Before, you mentioned Belarus, and I think, this seems to have also a key component of this changes in the nuclear doctrine, as this was mentioned as being one of the areas. And it reminded me a bit about a discussion that me and Alexander had with a Belarusian ambassador, Dmitry Mironchik, and he was effectively arguing that one of the reasons back then why Russia had transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus was because they were seen to be a possible step on America's nuclear escalation ladder. That is, to get to instead of attacking Russia directly, which would likely cause a total nuclear exchange, it's a good way of getting to Russia and punishing Russia by simply attacking an ally. Now, it seems in the West like an outlandish accusation, given we would like to think we would never do such a thing. But he pointed us to this interesting article from the Atlantic, actually, where it was based on a report in which Obama officials they had established an advisory group to how the U.S. would respond to a hypothetical Russian invasion of a NATO country, and how then the U.S. should proceed up the escalation ladder. So what did they recommend? But as I said, the U.S. in this scenario, they didn't want to attack Russia directly with nuclear weapons, as they didn't want to end the world, but they reached the decision of striking Belarus was a good scenario. And again, I found this quote as well because I thought it was quite interesting from the article in terms of why the United States should attack. And this was from the National Security Council Principles Committee that recommended a nuclear attack on Belarus. And it argued, a nation that had played no role whatsoever in the invasion of a NATO ally, but had the misfortune of being a Russian ally. So in terms of, even if Belarus does nothing wrong, is not a participant of a conflict, it would still be considered to be struck with a nuclear weapon simply as a way of escalating against Russia. So it does seem quite dramatic as a step up the escalation ladder, but I guess it begs the question: what do you expect to see in this new nuclear doctrine of how Belarus is shifted? And Lukashenko now, he is expressing more and more concern that NATO might extend the war into Belarus. He then accuses the Polish. But do you see this as likely of Belarus becoming another front in this war? And
we see a lot of signs that NATO is preparing for a larger war. New bases or movable bases are being built in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, even I think Macedonia and others. So then they will be recruiting local forces in preparation for a possible long conventional conflict. I do not think that they are ready as of yet, but Western elites, especially European elites, are in such a unbelievable quagmire. I mean, they have lost all moral and political rationalizations for their rule, that they could unleash a war in order to save their own position. So, before the declaration, which was made by our president recently, it was believed that Belarus has a 100% umbrella. Now we know that it has a 100% nuclear umbrella, and that any attack, not only nuclear but conventional, on Belarus will be returned with the nuclear strike. As actually people like myself have been proposing that any attack on Russia should be returned by, at least could be returned by a nuclear strike. But we shall see. We do not want to tie the hands of our the decision makers, including the president. There is such thing as strategic ambiguity. He has to have the moral, political, and right and technological capacity to use nuclear weapons if anybody, by any means, attacks Russia. However, he has to have the possibility and flexibility of using nuclear weapons only in case of need. And of course, for the sake of deterrence, so that people like these idiots in Britain or in most of other Europe would understand that if they cross certain threshold, or even if they continue this war for too long, they will get a nuclear response. And that is obvious. But I hope that they will yield and retreat with dignity, rather than having Afghanistan plus.
I mean, you mentioned attacks on Russia. Of course, there is actually a proposal to do that, and it's being backed by the British government. The British Prime Minister went to Washington and lobbied for it. President Zelensky of Ukraine is going to lobby for it again at the Ramstein meeting on the 12th of October, in a couple of days' time, in other words. And this is to launch missile strikes into Russia itself. Missile strikes which your president has said, if it happens, they can only be conducted with the actual direct involvement of Western military people. And that would be an act of war against Russia, which, by the way, I understand legally it would be, and that Russia would consider itself to be at war with any states that were to do this incredible thing. Now, there's a number of things I wanted to say, which is, again, you've studied the Cold War. We both lived through the Cold War. I can't say I've studied the Cold War, but I've lived through it. I cannot remember a single occasion during the entire Cold War period, a period when, as we said, deterrence was strong and underpinned the whole international system, where either superpower ever even considered doing this sort of thing against the other. I mean, I can't imagine the Soviets helping the Vietnamese to launch missile strikes on the United States, for example. I cannot imagine the Soviets assisting the Cubans, perhaps more practically, to launch missile strikes against the United States. I don't remember the United States in the 1980s helping the Afghan Mujahideen to launch strikes into the Soviet Union. I never remember anybody ever talking about doing such an incredible, irresponsible, astonishingly reckless thing. And yet we have lots of people advocating it. Every day I read articles in the media here in Britain of people advocating it. They say that what the Russians are saying is bluff, that we can go ahead and do it, and that they won't result in anything. And when the Russians say that we will be at war, we will, we can just disregard that because they don't mean it for real. I mean, what do people in Moscow think when they read all of this? I mean, first of all, is what your president said, is it a bluff? I get the sense, by the way, that the United States, or people in the United States, the Pentagon, is that they are taking it very seriously. But I mean, what is the perspective of all of this in Russia? I mean, how have we got to this position? I mean, back in the early 70s, as I said, it was ruled out even striking at Soviet ships delivering weapons to the North Vietnamese in Haiphong. And now we're talking about not just attacking Russian merchant ships, we're talking about attacking Russia itself. That is the degree of recklessness that we've reached now. But as I say, what do people make about this? What, I mean, is this, and presumably this is being widely discussed in Russia now, presumably not just at expert levels. Anyway, just over to you on this.
Well, obviously, it's, I would say that is a result of this strategic parasitism and I would say degradation of the intellectual ability of most of the Western elites. And I'm saying that it is a process which is progressing. I'm sorry, it's of course it's a regress, and so we have to stop this process. This regression one way or another, or else, I mean, we're doomed. Now, but I believe that, I mean, we waited for too long. And actually, there have been already strikes on the Russian territory by drones. And people were killed. and I think that is already casus belli. And but we have all kind of debates. Where is the threshold? My belief is that if people in Belgorod or one course are attacked, I mean, there should be a devastating attack on the sources of that attack, and that is on NATO. First, non-nuclear. If there was a return, then it should become nuclear. The Americans have been bluffing that if Russians deliver a strike on Europe, they would immediately devastate our military forces in Ukraine or in Ukraine or Russian fleet in Crimea. But we send signals that then they would have a second wave. And if they will continue, there'll be a third wave. And that would mean, I mean, killing 100,000+ American soldiers in Europe and all over the world. Americans are very vulnerable. They have, I think Americans are starting to understand that their overextension is also a vulnerability. That's why they're gradually retreating from Europe, but but on the way out, they're igniting Europe so that if we do not control that land, let it be burning. That is happening with Ukraine. That will happen with the other European countries if they do not stop on this way to disaster. They are not only now being robbed by Americans who have imposed on them extremely interesting economic conditions, whereas they have to import American expensive fuel instead of Russian inexpensive fuel, and also by the fact that now Europe is considered to be not a safe place for investment, and so a lot of investments are running away from Europe towards the United States and production lines. So I mean, Americans, instead of now they're losing their capacity to rob the world majority or the global South as they used to. So they have another option, and that is robbing Europe. But Europeans are, I would say, they're elites which are completely comprador. Now, I hope there will be change sooner or later. They would start to understand that they are the victims. The first are Ukrainians. The second are Europeans. The third are Russians, because we have to lose good men and also waste money on this country. But the biggest losers are poor Ukrainians, poor stupid Ukrainians, and not that yet poor, but very stupid Europeans.
Yeah. I don't really have any more questions. I just wanted to make a remark. That's because I remember back in a decade ago, I was teaching some nuclear strategy and the deterrence in Australia, and I remember making the point that we sent all the wrong signals when, for example, countries that gave up their weapons of mass destruction programs, be it Iraq and Libya, those were destroyed, while countries who were able to develop it, be Pakistan and North Korea, they were then safe. So this kind of sent the wrong signals that, just develop weapons of mass destruction and you'll be good. But now it's a whole new level. I feel like the signal now is we are increasingly rejecting nuclear deterrence. We're rejecting the principle of nuclear peace, but this only makes it more likely that one would use nuclear weapons, and also it puts pressure on countries to actually, like Russia, to lower their nuclear threshold. It does seem like complete madness, and I guess with all the optimism we had after the Cold War, it's such a tragedy that this is where we are now, where we're actually preparing direct war to destroy each other. It's a great tragedy.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, but I do not want to blame only our Western partners or enemies for that. I must say that we relaxed for a while and forgot that basically the peace in the world, and also the peace, especially the peace in Europe, which is the worst place in the world in terms of unleashing the worst wars and the worst fratricidal wars in the history of humanity, and also the worst ideologies. That we have decided that that we do not need to deter, and it was our mistake, and I would say even sin. But I hope we shall come back. I am partially seriously, partially metaphysically saying that the nuclear weapons have been given us by the Almighty, who saw that Europeans in one generation have been killing each other twice to make them sane. And for a while it worked, but now we see that they are losing their sanity. So I am calling openly on President Putin that it is his duty to not only to Russia and the world, but even to the Almighty to restore us fear.
I would add that it was also a massive undertaking by the Soviet Union to achieve nuclear strategic parity. I mean, anybody who understands or is familiar with the history of that time would know the resources and the intellectual energy and commitment that was invested in achieving that, and the enormous way it changed the entire international landscape from about the mid-1960s when it was achieved. This is just to say, I mean, and it does seem surprising actually, but if I may say so, not entirely out of character with Russians, as far as I can see, that having achieved all of that, having achieved a certain stabilization in Europe, they said to themselves, well, we've achieved that. We brought the people there to their senses. Now let's turn our swords into plowshares and press forward with peace and try and be friends with these people all over again. Going all the way back to the 1890s, Tsar Nicholas, I remember, was already proposing all kinds of peace summits and disarmament conferences. This is very much a characteristic, I think, of Russians. I'm going to just ask one very last question. This is a very last question from me. What is the mood in Moscow now? This is just about the war and about the general situation. In the West, there is despondency, even publications like The Economist admit that the West is losing in Ukraine, which they are. They've said that explicitly. They use that word losing. Everybody can see that the Russians are winning in Ukraine. I'm going to suggest that all of these latest ideas that are floating around in the West, deep strikes into Russia, accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO, they are all the last gasps of people trying to come up with some kind of plan to turn around what is now an irreversible situation. But what is the mood? Is it euphoric? Is it realist? Are there any expectations we're going to get back to a stable relationship with the Europeans in the future? Are people very disillusioned? What is the mood?
Our calculation is that about if we survive through this crisis, and Europe is not done away with. Hopefully not totally, but in a way, if it gets a few nuclear strikes, it is done away with. Then there will be a change after a crisis, a change of generations of leaders, and now they're called populists, right or left, but they're mostly reasonable people. I mean, understanding, what is the real world. And that generation would come in about 15 years, and then we could restore some of the relationship. Of course, it will be not extremely cordial, and also because now Russia has turned and is turning very rapidly towards where it is, and it is Eurasia. And I'm so happy about that because we have finished our European journey, which I think should have been finished 100+ years ago, before we were infected by Marxism-Leninism, which was in its worst sense, because there are a lot of elements in Marxism and Leninism which are perfectly sensible, but we got the worst of that. We should have stopped that about maybe at the beginning of the previous century, before the war. But unfortunately, the agony of leaving Europe have been prolonged, and we suffered for that a lot. But now, we are becoming truly Eurasian, and we are getting back to where we should be. Russia was born as a partially European country, but with very few connections with Europe. The main connection with Europe was through Christianity, which came from Byzantium, which was not quite Europe, which Europe, but which was that time the best of the Christian civilization. That's why Russian pagans took Christianity from Byzantium, but then from 16th century, our positions in the world have been built up on on our development and conquering and development of Siberia, and engulfing all the cultures and all the genes from Siberia. Russia has been a very unique colonial power, which has been integrating the nation, the ethnicities it conquered, and or integrating with them. That's why we become so multicultural and open to the outside world. So we are turning back to where we are, where we should be, and that's why my next project will be Siberianization of Russia, but that will be the subject of the next several articles, hopefully when I finish this work with the nuclear matters. And it is much more pleasant, I believe. I've just returned from a trip to Siberia, to former capital of Siberia, which is called Pomorsk, a beautiful place, fantastic. And I'm traveling, and I love Siberia. It is the future of humanity, future of Russia. So we will move there, but hopefully, with the change of European elites, we will restore some of our relationship with Europe, and we'll have a correct relationship with some European nations. And Europe will probably also become several Europes, because, of course, the European project, as it was built since late 40s, early 50s, is done away with. So we'll see what will come out of it. Hopefully, Europe will not come back to the European normal situations where everybody fights everybody. But we'll see. But anyway, we'll be happy that Europeans would return to us. We are true Europeans. The better Europeans will return to Russia, who are Eurasians, but also true Europeans.
You sound a bit like Dostoevsky. I think he said something like that.
I was just going to say. I was just thinking, Dostoevsky wrote about the ungrateful Europeans, and the soul and future of Russia would be in the East. I was just thinking about, the same exact thing.
Absolutely. And that is, we could talk when we meet about that, because I will finish with official. I've been rereading Dostoevsky now, after understanding that he was born as a great thinker and a writer. When he was in hard labor, he was a revolutionary and sent to hard labor. But one of the previous generation of revolutionaries gave him Bible, and for 4 years he read only Bible, and from there he became one of the greatest thinkers and writers of the world. And you could not understand his works without reading Bible. Now I'm I have a special edition with explanations of and connections of his faith and his work. It is unbelievable.
We have a lot to discuss there because I'm a very interested in Dostoevsky. Just to say, Westerners do not understand him at all. Just to say,
it's more pleasant than discussing nuclear strikes, counter strikes, etc., etc. Okay, thank you very much.
Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much for discussing this very.
And soon I'll send you this book. This book on new strategy of deterrence. It is a small book. It's about 150 pages. It has been already. It is out of print in the virtual. I think will bring it to the online meeting, and when it is official out of print in several days, we shall send to our friends the translation, which is also ready. It has been translated also several times already in China, because we have exchanged with Chinese before.
Right.
Okay. Take care, and we shall.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.